Hi, welcome to another quick tutorial for Final Cut Pro 10. This time I'm talking about motion blur inside Final Cut. This little trick I stumbled upon when I was editing lately, and I'll show you how to add motion blur to animations within Final Cut. If you look at the timeline we have here, if you look at that project, what we have here is a 3D text layer. That's just a preset I put here. On top of it, I animated this shape layer. As you can see, it's just a couple of keyframes and I moved it up and down. Then I have this rotating rectangle at the bottom right and a star that's scaled up and down repeatedly. All of these things are animated with keyframing the parameters for X and Y, for rotation, and for size, as you can see here in the inspector. As you also notice, there is no motion blur rendered by Final Cut Pro 10. So every frame, all those shapes and text layers are perfectly sharp. That is something that had always bothered me when I was animating stuff inside Final Cut, because if you add motion blur to moving elements or clips, it makes the motion seem a lot smoother and much more natural. You might be familiar with a concept or a technique used by Final Cut Pro 10 editors that is called the adjustment layer. It's basically a text effect published by motion with no text in it. Let me show you. We open up Motion, Final Cut Pro title. As you can see here, you get a title template to create your own title. It has a text layer up here and a background layer that is replaced by whatever is underneath the text clip in Final Cut Pro 10. We delete the text layer and we are only left with the background layer. If we publish this to Final Cut Pro 10, let me switch back here, you end up with something like that. It's an empty title effect. I can put this title effect on top of any clip in the timeline. And I can, for example, put a color effect on this adjustment layer, and I just push the color to the extreme red here, and I have colored everything that is underneath this adjustment layer effect. This technique has been known for a while to Final Cut Pro 10 users, but recently I found out that you can use this technique to add motion blur to things animated within Final Cut. And that's how you do it. I switch back to Motion and I have this adjustment layer title effect still loaded here. And all I need to do is I have to go to the project settings, project properties, Command J. There's two settings that affect the look of the motion blur. That is samples and that is shutter angle. So the bigger the shutter angle is, the more motion blur you get. And the bigger the count of samples is, the smoother the motion blur gets at the end. Because you cannot publish samples and shutter angle inside your Final Cut Pro 10 title effect, what I did is I published 3 different pairs of settings to Final Cut Pro 10. If you come over here, I have published a motion blur of 180 degrees with 12 samples, a motion blur settings with 16 samples, and 360 degree motion blur, and a motion blur with 720 degrees and 32 samples. So as you can see here, if I go to this first marker, you can see that there is already a lot of motion blur going on here. And if I switch that off, you can see motion blur is gone and motion blur is back. I have the exact same composition with the other motion blur settings. I can jump to the next marker by coming up here to Mark and select Go to Next Marker, or Command, I work with the German keyboard, Command E. So I go here. That is the motion blur settings of 180 degrees and 20 samples, or 12 samples, excuse me. The next, I jump over to this marker and I have a 360 degrees shutter angle with 16 samples. So the motion blur gets a little longer. And if you don't want to see those discrete steps in the motion blur, you have to increase the count of samples. But remember, the more samples you have Final Cut Pro render, the more rendering time it needs. And I jump to the last setting I have, which is 720 degrees and 32 samples. So you can see there's even more motion blur going on here. All the animated layers are affected by the motion blur, the XY animation, the 3D text, Z animated, the scaling star, and the rotating square. And what's even cooler than that, the last bit I have here is I have a bit of a footage clip here of a waterfall that it's sped up to 819%. So it's like a time-lapse waterfall. And it looks exactly like would expect. Water is flowing fast, but it doesn't get blurred. And if you put the motion blur adjustment layer on top of it, I chose the 720-32 one, and you activate it, you can see that the water is blurred like it was filmed with a longer exposure. Well, I hope you can use this little trick. I'm animating a lot of Photoshop layers at times in Final Cut Pro, and I'm happy to have motion blur inside Final Cut and don't have to render everything in After Effects or Motion and import it as a clip into Final Cut. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.